Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla casa italiana zerilli-marimò della New York University. If I were a good host, I would have learned at least how to say buonasera in Chinese, but I have to admit I didn't learn. And
You can say ni hao ma.
Ni hao ma. How did it sound? Working on it. And I'm delighted to welcome back for the third time Patrizia Chen to present her new book here at Casa Italiana. Her two previous books we presented here. The first one, Rosemary and Bitter Oranges. It was a sort of culinary memoir of her growing up in Italy and the things that she learned through cooking. And it was not only cooking that she learned in this kitchen. And it's a beautiful book full of passion and feelings. And her second book was a book called It Takes Two, and of course it talks about tango. And it was about her journey of discovery and self-discovery in Argentina and through the different paths that tango takes, also here in New York. And we are delighted that finally tonight we have a chance to talk about her new book. And you see the cover there, and I remind you that there are copies of the book upstairs, and Patrizia will be happy to sign them for you. And it's a book that calls very close to home, very much like the two previous ones. And in this case, it talks about Patrizia's discovery of her in-laws family. And her husband Kimball is here, and you see a portrait of him on the top right as a very, very cute baby. And you can make it. Thank you, Kimball. And I was telling Patrizia that it feels like I read the book even before reading it because I followed the different steps. And when she was sort of uncertain whether to start writing about that, especially investigating and doing research on her husband's family, and then while she progressed into it and she became very, very passionate about her work of research that allowed her to get to know not only her husband's family very well, but an entire civilization. And what I underlined in my little thought, as my colleagues call it, pensierino, in the invitation to this event, it's a very Italian point of view on her discovery of China and Chinese civilization through the microhistory of her husband's family. And I'm not going to take any more of your time because we have the author here, and the author is in very, very good company because she is with Nancy Yao Maasbach, who is the director of the Museum of Chinese in America, here in Chinatown. And Nancy has been working also previously for the Yale-China Association, the Council on Foreign Relations, and many other positions. And I'm delighted that she accepted to be here with us tonight and to discuss Patrizia's book with her. And I know there was already a very successful presentation of the book at MoCA. Can we say MoCA?
You can say mocha.
Thank you very much. So without further ado, please help me welcome Patrizia Chen and Nancy Yao Maasbach. Thank you.
Very familiar faces, and few whom I don't know, but I thank you all for coming here. And I especially thank Stefano for inviting me, as he said, for the third time. And in Italian we have a phrase that says non c'è due senza tre, that is, you cannot have two without a three. So he was forced to invite me again. And
you were forced to write a third book.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm delighted to have Nancy, with whom we had a really successful event, and it was great. And so, I don't know, I think Stefano asked me to read something. So I'm going to start without any hesitation and I'm going to read the preface, the first chapter. And I begin immediately with a disclaimer. Like everyone else, I'm many things. I'm Italian, I'm American, and I'm also a writer, a wife, a mother, a cook. What I definitely am not is a historian. I wrote this book through the eyes of a daughter-in-law. Relata refero, said the Latins. I tell what I've been told. In short, I'm just a reporter, in love with all things Chinese. Goong-Goong is not a memoir in the real definition of the word, and it's not even about me. It's about a family that took me in with open arms, about unusual traditions I gladly adopted and observed, about fascinating anecdotes and stories, stuff for novels, really, that proved to be real once I began to study the history of the Chen family. During my very first weekends with my new in-laws, I was puzzled by the beautiful old pictures depicting life in Shanghai in the 1920s and before. Elegant weddings, exclusive settings, sumptuous interiors, expensive cars. Those photos popped up in me as soon as I saw my father-in-law pasting them in big black albums. I was so surprised that nobody else was interested in finding out more about that past. Not even my husband Kimball knew anything about his grandparents and ancestors. How could that be? Why didn't he know even the most fundamental facts about his grandparents? His parents' childhoods? Well, the pages in this book and all the chapters will tell you about it. I started to ask questions. At first I was rebuffed by my father-in-law, but then, slowly, I began to collect information, and I discovered that I had married into an extraordinarily influential and important Chinese family. Yet, no one knew about it. Only my father-in-law, Goong-Goong, as I was instructed to call him, was the repository of that story. Had he agreed to be interviewed by me, and I asked endlessly, I would have made sure I fact-checked everything, but he refused, preferring not to be bound by an inquisitive daughter-in-law with too many questions. Instead, his secretary Jessica was allowed to assist him, keyword, silently. In the years to come, I knew that I had to write the story of this remarkable man and his family. The process of writing Goong-Goong was a never-ending avalanche of discoveries. I did my best to be as historically accurate as possible. Dates and specifics were drawn from my own notes and my father-in-law's dictated memoirs. I read books, I searched for dates, I asked old Chinese friends, as in really old. Unfortunately, many details and family names are lost. I wish I had been able to fill in all those blanks that drove me and my editors crazy during the writing and editing of this book. The Chinese Revolution, for example, is seen through my father-in-law's eyes. He was barely 14 when the first socialist ideas gave way to a youth movement and street protest in Shanghai. He had just graduated from Jiaotong University when he transferred to Purdue in the US, and so he didn't experience the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. He was lucky, since China's government policy of withholding higher education from children of the so-called privileged families damaged many of his relatives and friends. Goong-Goong escaped in time and was able to establish a luxurious life for himself and his family, but he gave back most generously throughout his entire life. Many of his friends and families were not as fortunate. My book is also a nod to those resilient people who navigated decades of difficulties and deprivation in China. They survived, and when it was all over, never complained about it. In 1978, China opened up, and from that moment on, slowly of course, the world was allowed to visit and get to understand this most fascinating country. Long after my father-in-law's death and during my stay in Shanghai in 2003, I was lucky to meet and establish a strong bond with a few key relatives, a bond that allowed me to learn and explore facts and details. Auntie Tsai provided me with an enormous amount of information. She drew on the last two generations' family tree and showed me who was who. Aunt Nancy, whom I visited and interviewed several times in Queens, New York, confirmed a few facts and added needed details. I chose to write this book in a non-chronological fashion and jumped into the dangerous waters of flashbacks because that is how I had been musing for many years about the Chens, my husband's family, and their history. I would wake up at night and remember an anecdote that my father-in-law had casually inserted in a conversation. The old family pictures that had suddenly ended up in my hands seemed to spring before my eyes and beg to have their stories told. Goong-Goong is divided into chapters and sections dedicated to subjects. death, food, family, trips. Random, perhaps, but hopefully bound by the common thread of my immense love for this family in China, a country that always felt as if it were mine. So, I don't know.
So, I was suggesting first that we must all read this book at least twice. But I have the great honor of moderating a conversation with Patrizia regarding the book, but really the context of the book and the similarities and the context in which it gives to us is such a gift. And I think maybe what we can do is, will you share the slides as well?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And maybe I can just encourage everyone, as you think about this, think about your own families. At the Museum of Chinese in America, we think about the untold stories. So many of us, all of us, are immigrants. And when we think about our own families, we think about the stories from the motherland or the old country. But the stories have no context. And I just wanted to say, as we start this conversation, that Patrizia has given a great gift to Chinese Americans, because she's lent some context to such a prominent family, which perhaps even the Chinese descendants of that family may not understand some of the impact and the influence that this family had, but she's placed it in a context. And sometimes we don't see our own family stories in the way that we should. And this is the gift that she's given us. And I'm so grateful for her for writing this book. And the prominence of this family is really quite incomparable. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, and maybe we can look at some slides and then delve into some of the issues.
So here, this is my mother-in-law, who was a very beautiful lady, who had studied piano and the harp, and she was a musician, a really great musician. This is more or less when she met my father-in-law. She was in a concert. He saw her and decided to marry her. Somebody who was sitting next to him, said, but she's a very good girl, and you should be very careful. And he said, I have honorable intentions. 6 months later, they were married. Oh, this is jumping a little bit too ahead. Oh, this is the family tree that was helped to be put together by Auntie Tsai, and it's in the book, so we don't need to go. As Nancy said, the Chen family has given a very, very important people to the history of China. One of them was the very first industrialist. His name is always so difficult that I had to go and check it out and read it. Yeah, that's it. Shen Xuanhuai. He was the first industrialist, and among the many firsts that he put together, he also built all the railways in China, and this is a bond that he signed. Oh, this is my father-in-law's father, uncle, and probably a tutor, but we don't know that. This is the family, the grandparents, and studying at home, and you can see how they are dressed. And this is one of the pictures that had really made me so curious about the family, because it's a really fancy wedding, and my father-in-law was pasting it. Apparently he was such a good-looking boy, as he said to me, that everybody wanted him as a page boy for their wedding, so that's one. This is a picture of my father-in-law's parents, their wedding. And in 1991, when we took our very first trip to China, the reason why we took the trip was not just to visit China with my father-in-law and through his eyes, but especially to bury her ashes that had been kept in a Buddhist temple in Hong Kong for many, many decades. And so we traveled everywhere in China with Aunt Nancy holding the ashes in a yellow silk package, and we finally were able to bury her, and it's all described. This is my father-in-law. I think he's incredibly handsome, right? And this is their wedding picture. This is my mother-in-law came from another kind of family. She came from a family from Guangdong, from Canton, and they were already established in San Antonio, Texas. So she was born there. This is the Shanghai family. My father-in-law is the first one on the left. His sisters are and brother are above. And what is really interesting in this picture are the parents. And let me tell you why. His real parents are the one on the right, his father and his mother. But as a very old Chinese tradition says, if the eldest brother and his wife are not able to have children, they can adopt one in the family. So these two adopted my father-in-law, and he was given like a package, you know. Here you cannot have a son, so here it is, our firstborn, and he was brought up as the heir to the Chen family and to the fortune and everything. Of course, the revolution happened and no more fortune, but he built it here. Again, very handsome Goong-Goong. Goong-Goong, by the way, is a Chinese name that means father-in-law, but also grandfather. I had my doubts about calling my book Goong-Goong because it's not really easy, especially now when somebody says, "Oh, what is the name of the title of your last book?" I say Goong-Goong, and then I say, "Why did I put this name?" Because I had to describe it, I had to spell it, and I had to explain what it is. And this is my husband with his mom. And this is exactly the time in 48 when my father-in-law met her, 49 actually, when he met her and fell in love with her. And we can stop here, and you can ask more questions.
Wonderful. So prepare your own questions. I'm sure you will have many, but I thought what might provide a little bit of a preface to it is if I can ask Patrizia a few questions. And I'm going to go off the back of Stefano. Is that he said she writes it from an Italian perspective. But many of you know, and I know Patrizia knows, that the Italians are the European Asians, and this is and the Chinese are the Asian Italians. So there are so many similarities that, as the Chinese American, we were always said that we're just like Italians. We focus on family, on education, and on food.
And clothes.
And clothing, right? And I wore my only pair of Ferragamo's today. To the Italian craft. But I wonder, Patrizia, what I notice most about your book and what I love about it is your observation. Because some things that you describe and you share, if I were to take a photograph, I wouldn't take that photograph. Because to me it's very common. It's something that doesn't seem extraordinary. And I think we miss a lot of those things in our own lives because we don't see the beauty in the everyday. But what you remark is you were persistent with Goong-Goong.
Oh yeah.
So persistent. And from my own experiences with elders, I have never been too persistent because they will sort of, no, that's not important. And it's not something you need to know. So tell us about the persistence and how you were first received by Goong-Goong, and how in the world you were able to get so much information and anecdote out of Goong-Goong.
Well, first of all, my father-in-law was a formidable man, extremely successful, extremely cultivated, very smart, very short attention span. Either you interested him immediately or nothing. Women were interesting only if they knew what they were talking about. So he had several friends whom he loved. They were lawyers, they were businesswomen, but in general he kind of dismissed people if they were fluffy. So I was desperately trying not to be fluffy, and I kind of appear very fluffy in general, so I was trying to impress him desperately. I managed to impress him in a bad way a couple of times. I'm going to tell you a terrible anecdote. that is in the book, but it's really terrible. One morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, we were in Far Hills, New Jersey, which was the family house, and everybody else was asleep during the weekend, and I was the only one with him at table and having breakfast. I was having my coffee, he was having his chiffon, the congee, and there was silence. The silence was so heavy that I decided that I had to break the silence and say something. So I said, you know, Goong-Goong, I need a daily massage to my cervix. Consternation came down on his face. I saw him got up and left. I said, why is he so ill-mannered? I have a terrible neck ache and back ache. Because in Italy, we say, oh, la cervicale. I have a problem with my cervical spine. And so for me, it was the cervix. And so I said, okay, this is really terrible. He's ill-mannered, he's not interested in me and my health. So I went upstairs and I sat and started looking. And then suddenly I thought, oh my God, let me go see the dictionary. S-E-R, oh no! And I did not tell Kimball that day, and I tiptoed down again. I was trying not to be seen. Anyway, having said so, did not make a very big impression on him, as you can imagine. But I was interested in everything. First of all, I was interested in anything that was Chinese and China. So I was asking questions all the time, and sometimes he would say, later, not now, later. Why do you have to ask so many questions? Why are you talking so much? And then I started, as a writer, I started going around always with the block notes and a piece, pen or a piece of paper. Sometimes something was so interesting that I had to jot down whatever he had said. And then slowly, I started to understand a couple of things. A, if I asked him about history, he would go on without stopping. So that was good. And so I was able to find out about a lot of things. And then in '91, when he invited us to the trip to China, we had a van. In every city we visited, we had a guide, a driver, and a white van. I don't know why, there were always white vans. And he sat in front with the grandchildren. And I sat next to him, made sure all the time to sit next to him, because whatever he mumbled, I was writing down. We were in Hangzhou Hanzhou, and suddenly we were in a tea field, more or less, and we were going up with this van, and the van was moving, and he suddenly said, "You see there? That was where our family house was. And you know what? The last time I was here, I was carried on a palanquin together with my grandmother, and for me." There was immediately an image that had stopped me.
And Goong-Goong, to put some context, I think your curiosity and your inquisitiveness and your desire to learn must have been some seed planted within him. Goong-Goong's his great uncle was one of the greatest philosophers and educators in Chinese history, Cai Yuanpei. So some people consider Cai Yuanpei second only to Confucius. And that context, so if you mention to anyone in China, they'll know Confucius, they'll know Cai Yuanpei as well. And as a more modern contemporary, he was quite renowned and revered. I wonder, in your inquisitive state with Goong-Goong, did he ever mention, was that the part that he was most impressed? And you need to take, this is a very modestly written, it's a very modest book. Patrizia is very humble in the way she does it. You need to take great pride in this beautiful piece, but I wonder if he saw in you something around your education, about your curiosity, about your tenacity that impressed him. So I guess my question is, what most impressed him that you think made him open up to you?
I don't know. I know the result. And the result is that a month before he died, he called me to his office in Far Hills, and he presented me with all the pictures, all these pictures, the black and white pictures that he had been pasting on those black albums. And I was really astonished, and I said, why me? And the answer was, because you care. And of course he knew that I was in love with China. I've been in love with China since I was 7. I'm going to repeat myself, but I always say the same things. I'm a wannabe Chinese. Always wanted to be Chinese. When we were in Shanghai the first time, I was going around with the wraparound sunglasses, and I'd asked Kimball, do you think that they think I'm Chinese? He looked at me and said, no. And I thought, so I was trying to be really Chinese. Never really managed. But that's, Tsai Yun-pei is my idol. Thank you for mentioning him, because I would love to be a historian, to be able to write about this man who deserves attention around the world, because there is a lot to say about him. But let me tell you just one thing. He was an anti-literam feminist, and in the right way. In 1912, he was Minister of Education, and he went to the parliament and advocated for voting rights for women. 1912. I just want to repeat the date. And the parliament did not accept it. He was angry. He left China, went to live between Berlin and Paris, and then eventually came back. He became president of Beijing University, which is the most important university in China. And what did he do for the very, very first time? He opened it immediately to women. And I have seen, one of the reasons why this book has a lot of information is because I was able to spend days and days with Auntie Tsai, his daughter, who was at that time, in 2003, was in her late 80s, spoke perfect English, was a teacher, a professor at the university in Shanghai, Jiaotong, which is like the MIT of China. And she filled in a lot of questions that I had, and she told me a lot about her father. She was living in their family home that had become half a museum. On top they were living, the bottom with the garden and everything was a museum. So now that everybody's dead, it's a complete museum. So she took me downstairs to see videos and movies that they had and documentaries that they had made about Tsai Yun-pei. And there was a film about his life. And one of the things that really shocked me was they had fictionalized his very first day at the University of Beijing. And you see him arrive in a long Chinese gown, the blue gown, and a Borsalino hat, very chic. It's Italian, Chinese, Borsalino. And there are the gardeners. And the gardeners are working. And they see him arrive and they flatten themselves against the wall because, you know, they are gardeners and he is the president. He comes, takes off his hat and says, "Ni hao ma, how are you? Good morning." And that was very important. It was a big difference. It was his socialist ideas and philosophy translated into reality.
Let's talk about Goong-Goong here in the U.S. You shared a little bit about his wife, Mei Li, Kimball's mother. What struck me, which is in the context of history, is that the two of them wed. It was a little bit of an unlikely pairing in many ways. And why do I say that? If we consider the last 100 years of U.S. history and Chinese immigration to the U.S., because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the only legislation against a group of people entering the country, there created quite a divisiveness among the Chinese in this country. So you had the laborers who came to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and then you had the elite scholars who came. So the laborers were often from southern China, and they came to the United States to build the railroads. And then subsequently, they stayed in the United States, their citizenship was taken away, and they were quite treated as second-class citizens. And they opened laundromats and restaurants, not because they liked washing laundry or cooking, but because there were no other opportunities available to them. So then what you had was a quota placed on Chinese coming in, and those were only for the intellectual elite, the scholars. And there were only a quota of 105 people could come in on an annual basis. there are almost half that number in this room. So what you have is your Goong-Goong, your father, who was of the most prominent Chinese family in many different ways and forms over generations. And then you had Mei Li, who was the daughter of Southern Chinese who had emigrated, I think, second generation.
Second generation, but she came from small landowners, a family of small landowners, so they were not laborers.
They're not laborers.
But her father had opened a grocery store, like a supermarket, and they were successful. And the children went to the good universities and everything. But
Right. I think
still
in
there is
some
a
ways
difference.
There was
Yeah.
a difference only because there was a discrimination and divisiveness between Southern Chinese and Northern Chinese.
also the language.
And the language, right, now there's a universal dialect, Mandarin. After the communists took over mainland China after the Civil War, they instituted one dialect. But before then, they couldn't even communicate.
But my father-in-law and my mother-in-law did not speak to each other
So
in
tell us
Chinese.
about that. So how interesting that, so they fell in love. Can you give us a little bit more about the circumstance and how they actually came in, the acceptance of the family's part on both sides?
All right. So, first of all, not many people know that if you speak Cantonese and somebody else speaks Mandarin or Shanghai, it's like saying, I speak French, you speak Italian, or you speak German. So it's completely different. My mother-in-law was educated in Cantonese and of course in English, American, because she was brought up here. She was a musician, as I said before, and my father-in-law fell in love for her art and especially for her beauty. She was really a great beauty. His mother, like a lot of mother-in-laws, did not really accept her completely, but Meili was a very kind and gentle and obedient daughter-in-law. Must have been terrible actually, because my father-in-law's mother was a dragon lady. She was really difficult. And no, that was that was my mother-in-law's mother. Yeah. Let's see. This is my mother, my father-in-law's mother, the dragon lady. This is during the funeral in Shanghai, where we had to stand and sit and kowtow for more than 5 hours, when Kimball, his father, his brother, and the 2 grandchildren were dressed in blue. Oh no, those are my. Oh, here. You see, they were dressed in blue robes, and that's how we celebrated the great-grandmother. During a really long ceremony. The ceremony was held at the Jade Buddha Temple, which is one of the biggest attractions in Shanghai, and it was also built by Kimball's ancestors. And it was the very first time after the Chinese Revolution that was open again for something religious. It took us 5 hours. Philip, the little grandchild, the little one, at the end, blurry-eyed and jet-lagged, looked at us and said, when I die, I will be kind to my family and I will not have a Buddhist ceremony. A couple of days later, we went to Suzhou, which was this lady, the dragon lady's family home, and we ascended a cemetery and we buried her there. Now, as in the Buddhist temple, offerings were made, and the altar at the temple was filled with food of every kind, and the tomb where where they put her, they buried her, it was also filled with offerings. At a certain point in Shanghainese, everybody started moving around. We were always followed by all these ladies that were relatives, capital R, because I never knew any name. So the relatives were running around and saying things rapidly in Shanghainese, and I didn't know what was all this commotion. And at a certain point, somebody found a cigarette, lit the cigarette, put it there. Everybody exhaled. Madame Gu Chen was now finally happy in paradise with the cigarette. Oh, this is us in the
Chinatown in Shanghai, which is something that I have always hated, the idea that the foreigners in Shanghai would say Chinatown. I'm sorry. Foreign town is where they lived, and this is really the town. That's me. But this is my father-in-law and his sister Nancy at the Forbidden City. It was empty when we visited it, completely empty. Has anyone been in Suzhou? Suzhou is the place of the beautiful gardens, and Liyuan is one of the most beautiful gardens. It's a must visit, and it belonged to the family. Belonged to the guy I said before, the name I never remember, the famous industrialist. He owned it. This is interesting. This is history. So one day we were in Beijing having breakfast, and Goong-Goong said, Nancy has something to tell you. Okay? And Nancy, tell us. And she said, well, you cannot leave the hotel. Why can't we leave the hotel? Because the Imperial Princess is coming to visit us. So they had been best friends, and she was the sister of the last emperor, and here she is in the middle. And she came with her husband and a couple of helpers, propped up because she couldn't really walk very well. And I was, I don't know, my eyes were starry because I was living history. The day before we had been at the Forbidden City. I might have walked where she had walked. Maybe, and so my imagination was running very, very quick, and I was imagining her with ermine capes and all the people behind her, and here she is. You can see her better, even though the picture is not fantastic, but here she is. And that's my father-in-law in America.
One theme that also runs through the book in many different ways and shapes and exhibited by your writing and your description is filial piety. I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about being an Italian looking at this Chinese family, and yet you see it throughout the generations in history, and then they come to the U.S., and your display of filial piety to your father-in-law, but also how has it transcended the generations, and what do you notice as an Italian that is sticks out in your mind? And also when you think about your nephews and thinking about how they view their family now that you've opened up some of the stories.
What you said before at the beginning, that Italians and Chinese are very similar, it's so true. I say it so much and so many times that I'm boring, because it's true. I was telling Stefano before this reading, because we like the same things. We seem to behave in the same way with completely different language, naturally. But if you go to a Chinese restaurant, you close your eyes, and you just don't think that you're in China. You think you could be in Naples. Children are running everywhere. The grandparents are respected and helped. There is the filial piety that you were talking about. It's for me, it's very important. Right now, I have my mother is 93. We are 3 sisters, and we're really taking care of her. And I was thinking, it's very important. It's something that you find in China, definitely, same as you find the love for children, for kids who are allowed. Yes, there is discipline, but children are also allowed to be children. And did I reply to your question, or was it?
How about the next generation?
The next generation, the grandchildren, I call them the grandchildren, my nephews, or Kimball's nephews. They're beautiful kids. They are these 3 boys and a girl. And for several reasons that I'm not going to get into it, they were not really, they really didn't grow up to be Chinese. And then they started looking for that. They started searching for being Chinese, for studying. One of them is a acupuncturist and studied Chinese medicine. They are really wonderful nephews, and we are very close to each other, thank God.
When you said that you were surprised that no one was interested in these black and white photos and no one seemed to be looking into them very much, it was almost as if closing the book on history. I wonder if you can share with us your thoughts about being American, and in this country, and how, you know, we're in such a precarious moment in our own history in this country, but we still have all of these stories and these ancestral homes. Where is being American for you right now, with all these different inputs in your mind, and with China so a part of who you are? What are you thinking about for the preservation of these stories, and where do you put them in the context? Do they stop with you in some ways?
Do they what?
Do they stop with you in some ways?
I'm not so sure that I understand what you mean, but to be American for me has always been a great desire, as well as being Chinese and also being very much Italian. My grandparents used to come to America twice a year, and they were always talking about this country where the politicians were not corrupt, and where things were always happening and finally going well. It was my dream country in terms of, you know, I was always very optimistic about this country and always hoping that the American dream would come true. I still continue to believe that the American dream comes true because strange things have happened. So if those things happen, it must be that, you know, anyone can reach a certain important position if you really want it or don't want it. I don't know. Let's not get into politics. But I don't know. I don't feel just Italian. Sometimes I feel very Italian. Sometimes I feel very American. Sometimes I feel very Chinese. I even felt very Argentinian. And I don't know. Maybe I'm schizophrenic because I like to be part of the cultures that I'm living in and also studying. So I don't know. Maybe I didn't answer well.
No, I think that was very well done. I have a final question about food, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I just want to let you know to prepare your questions. And I think Patrizia is open to anything.
Ooh.
Because it's already in the book, so you'll read about it. But the food theme, banquets, the culinary tales, your own sophisticated lens and expertise in food and culinary. Chinese food is so complex. Some people think it's just a stir fry in many ways, and yet every province has a different component and different elements. And there's also a lot of meaning in food with words that mean the same, but you'll eat a certain food during the new year because it sounds like the word for prosperous. And that's why we eat everything from pineapple to fish to rice cakes. There's no connection outside of the sound of the word. So tell us, when you were going through all of the culinary tales and some of the banquets that you went to, what struck you the most that we might have missed in your observations of family gatherings around the table, your observations of those, and how much a part of it was for Goong-Goong's family?
First of all, to order a Chinese menu, be it a restaurant or at home, is an art. It's an art form. You have to do it in a certain way. You cannot just go there and say noodles, because it makes no sense. You had to prepare. You had to have the cold appetizers. They are going to prepare your stomach in a certain way. Then you have the yin and yang. But there, let me just immediately open a parenthesis. In Italy, we do the same thing because we have precise ideas of how to present a dinner and what to offer and how to offer it. Not only, but in China, I was feeling, or with Chinese people, I always feel perfectly home because they say, eat this, it's going to be good for your hearing. Eat that because it's going to be good for your eyes. And in Italy, my grandmother, eat carrots, it's very good for your eyesight. And eat this and that because it's good for the liver, it's good for this. And so in China, it's the same thing. So it's to go to a Chinese restaurant is definitely with somebody who really knows. And one is Diane Wu, my friend to whom this book is dedicated. And I adore going out to dinner with her because she explains everything. She explains why she's ordering what and what is the meaning. And then you have hot food has to be followed by cold food, but doesn't mean temperature. It's yin and yang, so hot and cold. And together they make a harmony. They make something that becomes art.
That's beautiful. And then actually, again, you've made a comment that I would not have put together on my own. And Diane Wu, who you mentioned, the funny story about Diane Wu, and perhaps you heard this, when she was growing up, there was a cook who helped with the family's meals. And that cook was from Hunan province. But the cook was actually Cantonese. And so the cook eventually found his way to the United States. And he wanted to be prosperous as a restaurateur. And he called the food Hunanese food because it was a tribute to his province. But he only knew how to cook Cantonese food. So if you go to a restaurant that says Hunan Wok, it's actually Cantonese food. And that was started by Diane Wu's cook. But now there are a few places that are actually Hunanese food, which is a very different type of cuisine than Cantonese food. So that's because of Patricia's dedication to Diane Wu.
But in Italy, we had the same thing. Because if you go to Veneto, the food is different from a few kilometers away, that it's, I don't know, Emilia-Romagna or Milano or Sicily. Think about it, because we have had invasions of everybody in Sicily, for instance, the Arabs and the Spanish and the Normans. And so the Sicilian food has a certain kind of dishes that you will not find anywhere else. And the same is throughout Italy. And so I was never surprised by this difference in culinary dishes. And we had incredible experiences. We've been offered worms, blue and white and red in the honor of us being American, because Kimball, as a businessman, was always invited by the governors. We were sleeping and staying at the government houses, very fancy, and then we would have these fancy dinners that start promptly 6 and promptly end at 8, and we were offered these things. One day, we were offered something that looked to me like an omelette, and with little black dots inside. I said, truffles, like in Todi, like in Umbria, my home. So I started eating this wonderful omelette, and it was very good, a little crunchy, but good. And the person, the number 2, Kimball's number 2, was looking at me and going, And then I finished it, and he looked at me, Richard, and said, "Did you like the ants?" I had eaten ants, black ants. But you know what? Since they were good, I had another piece.
And there you have Patrizia Chen and her book, Goong-Goong, From Tuscany to Shanghai. Let's open it up for questions. Perhaps anyone on food questions, since we're in the general area of cuisine, and we can encourage. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about how food in your own cooking has been cross-cultured.
Has been what?
And maybe if you've come into some interesting ideas of
fusion,
crossing.
Not at all, because I'm an Italian cook, and I think that the Italian food is so big, so there is so much, there are so many differences that I rather continue to specialize myself in Italian food. What I can do is Chinese comfort food, therefore noodles with broth and something very simple. And yesterday, exactly last night, we were in Queens, where with my husband, we rushed to have a special dinner it was his birthday, so we went to a Shanghai restaurant hoping to find this incredible food. And we found a couple of very good recipes, and the others were a little mama hoo-hoo, not so fantastic.
Tiger.
Yeah. And, but what came to my mind was, I would love to spend a couple of months in Shanghai and learn how to cook Chinese.
And if she goes to Shanghai, she will see her great uncle-in-law statue there that we mentioned. Tsai Yuen-pei has a statue in Shanghai. And any other foods, questions about cuisine or?
Questions in general.
Questions in general. Sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, Goong-Goong seemed to be a very controlling in his narrative about the history of the family. And I was wondering if perhaps you could share with us an instance where his narrative was contradicted by whatever it is that you found in your research. And, in China, when you went to visit, either scholars or other families, and how you dealt with that in the book.
No, he was never contradicted because unless his historical memory or something can be contradicted by historian, whatever I knew, whatever I researched was actually true. And all his memories and the things he had told me they were always sounding right whenever I was asking somebody else about it. So no, I don't think so, unless somebody finds something different.
No, I don't mean in historical terms, but in families there are different versions of things.
Family versions, maybe one family member says
And
this.
exactly.
And then the other
In
family
family history, there is
But you
usually
have to
different-
remember that they were either all dead or completely re-educated. So a lot of these people were sent, those who had remained in China were sent to the faraway provinces to be re-educated so that they would not be the children of a very important family. They would become farmers, work the land, and they were, when I met them, it was really extraordinary, the difference between them, also physically, how they had suffered. They missed teeth, it was really, really terrible also to see the way they were dressed. What was interesting is that my father-in-law brought to America 32 students. So he completely provided visa and sent them to universities in America, educated them. 32 students, that's a lot. And many of them, all of them, he wanted them to go back to China and continue to rebuild China. And what is very interesting is that almost, I would say the majority decided to stay here, but those who followed my father-in-law's advice and went back to China prospered and became very important. Those who came here, normal, nothing special, but those who really listened to him and used the education that he provided them with here became very important there. One of the very interesting things is that not only my father-in-law had not told his children about his family, but also his brother Peter had not told anything to his own daughters, because my father-in-law had 2 boys and his brother Peter had 2 daughters. One of them was Michelle Obama's chief of staff, very close friend with the Obamas. So I called Tina to ask her what she knew about Uncle Peter, about his life in Shanghai and his arrival to America. And she said, I don't know anything. And I was really surprised. She knew even less than Kimball. And I said, Tina, but do you know that you belong to a really, really important family? She didn't know anything. So now she knows.
Yes.
It's a question regarding the pictures were beautiful and they tell stories by themselves. And I understand how fascinated you must have been when you found them and your desire to find out more about them. And one thing especially that struck me was that in several of these pictures there are some of the relatives that wear very traditional Chinese garments and some of the younger people that wear Western dresses in what seems a very early stage in Chinese history. So was this something peculiar of Kimball's family because of their social position and what they did, that they were exposed to Western fashion, not only in terms of clothes, but also in terms of education and mentality
Yes.
At a very early stage compared to anybody else in the country? Or was it something common?
Think Bernardo Bertolucci, The Last Emperor. When I saw that movie, one of the very first things I asked my father-in-law was, there was a scene where the last emperor is in a car and he's chewing gum. He's dressed in a black tie with the 2 wives dressed to the nines in Western clothes. And I said, was it like this? It's impossible. And he said, no, it was exactly like that. And so the big families, the rich families were exposed to the Western world, and they were choosing what to do. My father-in-law went to school in a rickshaw every day, dressed in Chinese clothes as a child. And then as he grew up, he started being dressed in Western clothes because they were also more comfortable in a way, because warmer and everything. The picture that we saw before was, no, that's my daughter. The one that we saw here, was taken in 48. This was taken in 1948, and just immediately before my father-in-law, as he said, saw the writing on the wall, left China and moved to America. But they were all educated in English, and my father-in-law went to Jiao Tong University and studied English, and then he came to America for his PhD, master's degree, and then PhD. Then he went to London, went to the London School of Economics. So, they were educated in a very international way. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, right here. And
I have a loud mouth. It's less from the book than that I know you have a background in fashion and China and in Italy. I was wondering about a current event, if you think Chinese and Italian relations will be affected by Dolce & Gabbana and the ad that pissed off everybody.
Yeah.
Was that silly? Was that offensive? Was it just, I was curious what you think of it.
It was stupid.
Yeah.
Stupid and ignorant. Because if I have an empire like they do have, and I'm not particularly in love with Dolce & Gabbana as people, I saw them, when they were at the beginning and everything, they are very arrogant. If I have an empire like that and I want to sell to China or Japan or a place that I really don't know anything about it, I will hire somebody who knows. And before I send around a video on TV, on social media, I'm going to ask, what do you think? But not even an Italian Chinese person. I'm going to ask a person there, and they already had offices, they had stores, they were organizing a big Shanghai fashion show. Why would they do something like that? It's like if I go to the Middle East, I'm not going to sit with showing the sole of my shoes to the people, to the audience, because I know that in that part of the world, they think it's an offense. So, one has to be smart and find out what is it that it's offensive and what is not. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Speaking about cross-culture, and I wanted to ask you this as people prepare other questions. You talk about suffering from the Jhumpa Lahiri syndrome. And as we know, Jhumpa wrote a book in Italian and was very prized about that. But the idea that you're trying to explore this very Chinese culture and history and the Chinese language, that you actually are very, very, very proficient in Chinese. I think it sounds great to me.
No, not to me.
But talk a little bit about that part, and you're doing all of this investigating, doing all of this writing, making sure that it was accurate, interacting with Goong-Goong and the family members, with your Mandarin. Do you still feel like you could have done more if you were a native speaker?
Yes. One of the things that struck me is that since I told you before that I'm a wannabe Chinese, whenever I studied Chinese, and when I got engaged to Kimball, because I really wanted to learn the language. Then I discovered too quickly that my father-in-law was speaking Shanghainese and Mandarin with a Shanghainese accent. My mother-in-law was speaking Cantonese, no Shanghainese. Between them, they were speaking English. Everything I was learning, they were correcting. He was correcting in one way. She was correcting in another way. My brain was going crazy. And so, yes, I studied several times. I could have been very proficient because I love it. The problem is that I feel that if I don't know, maybe drink a glass of wine, I can speak Chinese fluently.
That's the Italian in you.
And I don't. I walk around Beijing and I listen to the accent and I love it. I listen to people speaking Mandarin. I turn around because I feel at home. Which home? I'm Italian, I'm American, I'm not Chinese. But I feel like I could That's the Jhumpa Lahiri syndrome, that I would love to be able to speak in this other language, and I would have loved to learn it. But at a certain point, I decided it was too complicated. But you never know. I'm 70 years old. I still have a lot of life in front. You never know.
And additional questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
The thing I found most, well, one of the things I found most remarkable is that you said that you wanted to be Chinese since you were a little girl. And there weren't many, if any, Chinese in Livorno back then. So I'm wondering where that came from. And then it occurred to me that there's a part of Livorno that's called Shanghai.
Yeah.
And so is there any connection or what?
That's a very funny question. All right. So there were no Chinese in Livorno, and Shanghai is, I don't know why they have that barrio that is called Shanghai in Livorno, but we also have Korea. So there. But the reason why I discovered China was my mother-in-law, my grandmother, Valentina, who's been probably the most important influence in my life. And Valentina gave me a book by Pearl Maasbach, The Good Earth. Now, it was not talking about elegant people. It was not talking about, rich people or the emperors. Nonetheless, I was completely taken. And I fell in love at the age of 7 with China, and I started to devour any books that would come in front of me under my hands about China. So from hot novels, which I would find and hide, and also my grandparents had a library, and in the library there was a beautiful book of pictures, and these pictures, it was only pictures, and the pictures were depicting beautiful families with beautiful gowns, and so I would spend hours looking at those pictures and that book and say, I would love to be there.
And here she is. Additional questions? Well, maybe would you like to read another passage? And
I don't want to bore.
No, I think there's so many sections, and I don't know if you want to do a closing reading for us.
I think I'm going to read about names.
I like that part.
You like that part, right? So first of all, let me find it. So I will jump in order not to be too long. I was the firstborn son, the 12th day of the 6th moon in the Chinese calendar in Shanghai. Goong-Goong resumed on a fine summer day as we pored over one of his picture albums. July 27th of the year 1920 in the Western calendar. My beloved books and novels about China, my favorite subject since I was 7, there we go, were all I could think about at that moment. Now I was living them. As I looked at these photos, I noticed the walls of his family compound. I pictured my father-in-law and his 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother, running around in their silk gowns. The entire Chinese iconography came alive before my eyes. My name is Chie Yuan Chen, as you know, he continued, jolting me out of reverie. A name in China is a complicated matter. There is a generation name, in this case Yuan, which is chosen from a special poem that the family hands down from the very first ancestor. Every generation chooses one word from that poem, and that word becomes a name for their children. In the Chen clan, he belonged to Yuan, while his 2 sons had Wei in their names. The astrologist had advised Goong-Goong's parents to call him Chie. As was custom in China, a fortune teller had read his future and warned that his life lacked one of the 5 essential elements, wood. Together with metal, water, earth, and fire, the elements are supposed to be crucial parts of our existence. In his case, his name lacked the radical of wood to protect him, and so the name Chie would reestablish a perfect balance. Of course, not knowing Chinese, it was difficult for me to understand the concept. More than just the idea behind it, it all had to do with the way the ideograms are literally composed. My father-in-law drew his name on a piece of paper and pointed the various elements that compose his name. Understood? I did, but just for the few minutes following his explanation. I would never be able to explain again except by repeating his words. What happened, though, is that at a certain point, I decided that I also wanted to have a Chinese name. So what happened is that I was studying with Loretta Pang, who was a well-known teacher from Columbia University. And one day, as I was taking classes with her, she decided that she was going to give me a name, and she wrote it down, and she gave it to me. So the following weekend, I'm in Far Hills, and I run to my father-in-law and I say, I too have a Chinese name. After all, I was a Chen Tai Tai, a Mrs. Chen now. I had earned the right to get one. So Loretta Pang, celebrated for her calligraphy skills, had showed me a pink piece of paper. On one side, she had drawn a few bold characters, and underneath, its somehow romantic translation. I was to be Ge Bao Zi. Bao as in treasure, precious, and Zi as in lucky, auspicious. Ge, to say the truth, left me a bit confused. It was supposed to mean a creeping, edible bean from the fibers of which cloth is made. Really? Was she taking into account my love of fashion? Nonetheless, I was delighted. I wanted to show it to my father-in-law. For days, I had played the moment in my head, imagining his joy at discovering that I had gone completely ethnic. I wasn't prepared for the look of dismay on his face. As I presented him with my new precious name card, he turned red, and in his dangerously soft way told me that he, and only he, the Patriarch, was supposed to give me a name. How could Miss Pang have dared, a woman who wasn't even part of the family? The pink piece of paper disappeared into my pocket, and I retreated silently to my room. Once again, I had missed an opportunity to be silent. The following weekend, Goong-Goong summoned me to his office and surprised me with a card inscribed with black characters. He had spent time choosing a name for me, the wife of his eldest son. From now on, I was Pei Zuo, sprouts appearing above. At the age of 40, I had been given my Chinese identity. I was overwhelmed. And somehow there should be my name. Yeah.
Patrizia Chen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.